Much of the initial framework of the developing embryo is composed of hyaline cartilage, which is derived from mesenchyme. As a reminder, all connective tissues are derived from mesenchymal cells. And so this cartilage is laid down as a sort of template for what will become the mature skeleton of the body. And this happens by a process called endochondral ossification. As was the case for intramembranous ossification, you're going to be responsible for explaining the process of endochondral ossification. So this recording is to serve as a guide through the series of steps that produce the long bones of the skeleton. To begin, the chondrocytes, which is the term we use to describe cartilage cells, the chondrocytes will proliferate, which means they're going to multiply and go through mitosis to produce additional cells. Those cells will then undergo the process of enlargement or hypertrophy, and eventually they're going to die. And so as these cells die, they disintegrate and leave behind cavities in the matrix. Meanwhile, you're going to have invasion of the cartilage model by blood vessels. And these blood vessels will carry mesenchymal cells with them, these stem cells that will serve as osteoprogenitor cells. And so it brings these stem cells to the region, and they will mature based on chemical signals that are in the cartilage template. And so they differentiate then to become osteoclasts, bone marrow cells, and osteoblasts. The osteoblasts are going to deposit a layer of bone on the cartilage matrix, and this layer will eventually become the compact bone of the diaphysis and a long bone. As we continue through this process, we find that the cartilage in the center of the bone is also going through some changes. It will begin to disintegrate, and blood vessels will continue their invasion of the cartilage template and bringing stem cells with them. And so the stem cells enter the central region, differentiating. As we've seen, our osteoprogenitors differentiate to become osteoblasts, and they will form the primary ossification center that's going to produce that central core of spongy bone that will eventually hollow out and become the medullary cavity in the long bone. As the formation of the long bone continues to progress, we go through a period of growth and remodeling in which the medullary cavity will be created in the long bone. So the spongy bone that had been laid down by the primary ossification center is degraded, and the central area becomes filled with that red bone marrow. So it's going to contain our hemopoietic cells that will form the red blood cells, platelets, white blood cells that appear throughout an individual's lifespan. And we also have continued osteoblast activity, allowing for the diaphysis to thicken. And we're going to continue to lay down bone in sheets along the rest of the bone, which allows it to lengthen and increase in its diameter. So the process of mineralization of the bone during this growth period is going to continue going from the direction of middle of the bone towards the ends. And so you have creation of the secondary ossification center. So again, we're going to have our osteoblasts doing their job and producing more of that osseous tissue as the capillaries invade and our blood vessels bring additional nutrients and stem cells to the area. Because of the work performed at the secondary ossification centers, the epiphyses are soon going to be completely filled with spongy bone. And so there will just be a thin layer of cartilage that remains at the periphery, and we call that layer the articular cartilage. Articular refers to the term we use to describe joints, or the surface at which two bones meet. And so over time, that articular cartilage is going to be reduced to become thinner and thinner until it's just really just a thin superficial layer that will line the ends of the bones or line the epiphyses. So in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, there's a region of cartilage that remains called the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate. We'll be taking a closer look at what happens at the growth plate, but let's fast forward a bit now. We're looking at the body and the skeleton once you finally matured and reached puberty. And so at puberty, the combination of the rising levels of sex hormones and growth hormones and thyroid hormones will stimulate bone growth dramatically. So our osteoblasts now are going to begin producing bone faster than the chondrocytes are able to keep up with their production of cartilage. And so as a result, the growth plate is going to become more and more narrow until ultimately it's completely going to disappear and be replaced by all bone. And so at that time, we call that closure of the epiphyseal plate the epiphyseal line.
During embryonic development, cells called chondroblasts begin secreting cartilage that develops in the shape of the skeleton's long bones. The bluish, transparent avascular tissue formed is called hyaline cartilage. As the cartilage grows, the chondroblasts in the interior calcify and die. Blood vessels penetrate the structure and deliver osteoblasts. These cells lay down bone material. As the cartilage ossifies and spongy bone forms, a medullary cavity develops. At the ends of a long bone, ossification from cartilage also occurs. This process, in which hyaline cartilage becomes bone and grows, is called endochondral ossification. Bone growth continues through childhood. After puberty, bone tissue replaces the remaining hyaline cartilage, and the shaft reaches its adult length.
Let's take a closer look at the growth plate. The chondrocytes within the epiphyseal cartilage are arranged into zones, and on the epiphyseal side, the chondrocytes continually add new cartilage. And so in this picture here, this is the epiphyseal side, so this is the side that's closer to the end of the bone. And so in zone 1, you call this the proliferation zone, and this is the place where the chondrocytes are continuing to divide. And as we proceed down into zone 2, the hypertrophic zone, the more mature cartilage cells will enlarge. So as they are increasing in size, they begin to deteriorate. And whenever cartilage deteriorates, we find that blood vessels are sure to follow and invade and bring with them osteoblasts. And so the next zone then becomes the calcification zone. And so this is where our osteoblasts are going to start secreting minerals to form the osseous tissue and create new bone in the ossification zone. And so on the diaphyseal side, chondrocytes are degenerating, and osteoblasts are continuously invading this zone and replacing it with bone. The osteoblasts are therefore moving toward the epiphysis, which is being pushed away by the continued production of new cartilage. So again, our osteoblasts are coming from the blood vessels up through here, and they are migrating upward from the diaphysis, pushing the cartilage up. And so this region of cartilage is gradually going to become thinner and thinner as this bone increases in its length. The activity that we saw at the growth plate explains how the bone increases in its length, but we haven't discussed how the bone will increase in its diameter, and that takes place in a process called appositional growth. Now, this process is very similar to the fashion by which trees add rings or growth rings to their trunks. If you cut down a tree trunk, you see that you can almost follow the history of that tree by looking at the rings, and darker rings indicate times of drought, and lighter rings indicate times when there's greater amounts of rain. Similarly, when we look at cross-section of bone, we can see a history of growth here as well. And in this case, rather than them being rings of carbohydrate material, we're adding rings of collagen and minerals to the bone. So what we find is that this appositional growth is going to be produced by osteogenic cells in the inner layer of the periosteum, and so they will differentiate into our osteoblasts, which should come as no surprise at this point that if we're laying down bone, osteoblasts must be involved. And so they're going to add bone matrix to the surface. And so this addition of successive layers of the circumferential lamellae to the outer surface of the bone results in these rings. that we see in the figure. And so over time, the deeper lamellae are actually going to be recycled, and they will be replaced with the osteons that are typical of compact bone. So while the bone is being added to the outer surface by those osteoblasts, the osteoclasts are also at work, and they are breaking down bone and removing and recycling the older layers of the lamellae in the inner surface, which enlarges the cavity at the center that we call the medullary cavity. The superficial layer of our bone is wrapped in the periosteum. You may recall that it has a fibrous outer layer, and then deeper you have the cellular layer, which is where we find our osteoprogenitor cells, so crucial to the formation of our osteoblasts that will lay down these additional layers of bone. So the periosteum isolates the bone from surrounding tissues and provides a route for the blood and nervous supply to get to the bone. It's also actively participating in our bone growth and repair because, as we've seen, this cellular layer is where our osteoblasts are going to originate from. So as the bone grows, collagen fibers from tendons and ligaments and the joint capsules actually become cemented into the lamellae by osteoblasts from the cellular layer of the periosteum. And so this region where the collagen fibers are sort of glued into place, we call these the perforating fibers. And so this method that the osteoblasts are implementing to hold these fibers into place is extremely strong. And so typically if you have an excessive pull on a tendon or a ligament, you usually end up actually breaking a bone before you would snap any of the collagen fibers at the surface of the bone because it's just so well adhered to the lamellae.